We all can put in work to become more confident, clear, and compelling communicators. It takes three things: repetition, reflection, and feedback to do that. You have to practice, you have to reflect to see what needs to be changed and what you should lean into, and then you have to get feedback from trusted others. So if people take nothing else away from our conversation, and I certainly hope they take away a lot, it's that you can get better at your communication and it's well worth it to do so.
Welcome to the Ideas on Stage podcast, your regular insight into leadership communication.
Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
I am thrilled to be here with you. Thank you.
The pleasure is all mine, Matt. As I told you before going live, I've been following your work for some time, your podcast, your latest book now, and I think it's great. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. Today we're going to talk about the ideas in your latest book, Think Faster, Talk Smarter. So we're going to talk about spontaneous speaking, spontaneous conversations. And one thing, Matt, that I took away many insights, many lessons from your book. But one in particular, I would like to start with this idea that you're saying in the book that imperfection is okay. And it may sound for many people counterintuitive, but I love it as an idea. Imperfection is okay. Good enough is great. You also talk about maximizing mediocrity in your book. Can you tell me more?
Absolutely. And this is one of those counterintuitive notions that the book covers. The notion that we want to do our communication right, especially our spontaneous speaking, the answering questions, giving feedback, making small talk, drives us a lot. We want to give the best answer. We want to have the most insightful feedback. We want to be the most interesting person in small talk. And that puts a tremendous amount of pressure on us when we're in those moments. In fact, it can reduce our abilities to communicate well. Here's how it works. Think of your brain like a computer. It's not a perfect analogy, but if on your laptop or your phone you have lots of apps or windows open, your CPU, your central processing unit, is not as effective as it could be with each of those apps or windows. Your brain is the same way. If I am judging and evaluating and striving to do it perfectly, I'm using up precious cognitive resources that prevent me from actually being able to communicate well. So I like to say it's about connection, not perfection. We need to dial the intensity with which we evaluate what we're doing and just get it done. So I have the audacity, believe it or not, in front of my Stanford MBA students on the first day of class to say, this class is all about maximizing mediocrity in your communication. And their jaws drop. They've never been told to be mediocre. But after I give them the explanation and we do a few activities, they understand that they're actually getting in their own way. And by the time they leave that first class, they hear my entire statement, which is maximize mediocrity so you can achieve communication greatness. When we focus on just connecting, getting the information across, rather than trying to be correct, perfect, and right, we do it better. And the last thing I'll say is there is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and worse ways, but no one right way. So this maximize mediocrity, dare to be dull, is all about focusing on what true communication is about: connection.
And you mentioned exercises that you do with your students at Stanford, and you've included lots of examples, lots of exercises in your book as well, which I recommend for our listeners. Now, if we think about maximizing mediocrity and the fact that imperfection will happen, imperfection is okay, good enough is great. Now, that means that when we have a spontaneous conversation, mistakes can happen. Why not? I don't know whether we can call them mistakes or not, but it happens. And in your book, you talk about how to handle mistakes. And you talk about the idea of trying to move on to the next play rather than being focused on what just happened. Again, for those who haven't read the book, what does that mean? Moving on to the next play.
Right. So many of us in the moment when we make a mistake or we don't feel that we've done as well as we could or should, we ruminate. We in that moment say, "Oh, I should have done this or I could have done this," or we go internal instead of stay focused to what's going on around us. It's very normal, very natural. Here in the United States, we had a very famous college basketball coach. His name was Mike Krzyzewski. People called him Coach K. He's now retired. And he's the one credited with this mantra of next play. Rather than fixating and ruminating on what just happened, you need to move on. You need to get to the next place. So, as a basketball player, if I take a shot and I miss, and oh, I can't believe I missed, I've practiced that shot a lot. This really puts my team at a deficit. If I'm all there in my head in that moment, the other team has the ball down the court and I'm not helping my team defend. The same is true in our communication. If I make a mistake or I don't do as well as I want, or I start thinking about other things I could have or should have said, that pulls me away from the moment. So we need to stay present. We need to move on. So if we're having a conversation and I misspeak, I keep the conversation going. Now, clearly, if I say something inappropriate or offensive, I need to take corrective action. But in most cases, that's not what has happened. We just didn't perform to the level we wanted. So we move to the next play. Now, that doesn't mean we don't reflect later. I am a huge proponent of reflection. That's part of how we get better in our communication. But we don't do that reflection in the moment. We stay connected, we stay with it. So, this mantra of next play is very helpful to pull people from that fixation we have in the moment to keep the moment moving with those we're communicating with. So, I try to live my life with next play. I'll reflect later in the day and try to make note of what I could do better in the future. But in that moment, I stay present, I keep things moving.
In the moment, so staying in the moment, there's another key insight that I took from your book, which is another one that may seem as counterintuitive for many people. And it's the idea that if you want to be able to stay in the moment and to do it well, and in this case we're talking about having a good spontaneous conversation, then preparation in advance is key. So the idea of preparing in advance for a spontaneous conversation. Tell me more, Matt.
You're right. That's probably there are two key counterintuitive notions in the book. There's several, but the two key. The first is that we can all get better at our in the moment spontaneous speaking. Many of us feel we're either born with it or we're not. We have the gift of gab or not. So the first counterintuitive notion is you can get better at it. The second is exactly what you're talking about. We can prepare to be spontaneous. And people think that sounds really strange. But when you take a moment and step back, you realize that in many aspects of our lives, we do this already. If you're a musician and you play jazz music, for example, you do a lot of practicing and playing so that in the moment when you're riffing with your fellow musicians, you can play jazz. If you're an athlete, you do lots of drills over and over again. So when you're in the moment, in the game, you can agilely adjust and adapt. So the same is true with our communication. There are many things that we can do to prepare ourselves, and my book is full of those. So the first part of the book is really a 6-step methodology, and then the last part of the book, the second half, is all about how do you apply that methodology to specific situations. All of it is designed to prepare you. Think of it as sport practice to get yourself ready for the main events. And that's the key. Many of us feel like I just have to go do it. And in fact, you can prepare in many, many ways to help yourself do it well and to feel better about it.
Can you give us some examples of how to prepare well in advance for spontaneous conversations?
Well, certainly. So let me do it in two ways. I'm going to quickly introduce you to the methodology, and then I'm going to give some specific activities. Because part of the preparation is going through the first part of the methodology. The methodology is divided into 6 steps. The first 4 are all about mindset. And all of this mindset work can be done in advance. The first step is all about managing anxiety. The biggest barrier to successful communication, planned or spontaneous, is anxiety. Most people, upwards of 85% of people, feel nervous in high stakes communication situations. So that's step one, managing anxiety. Step two, we've already talked about, get out of your own way. It's that maximizing mediocrity. We have to see it about connection, not perfection. Step three is to see these spontaneous moments as opportunities, not threats. Many of us, when we're told we're going to be on the spot, like, oh, give a toast or answer this question, we see that as a negative, something to defend against, something to protect ourselves in, rather than an opportunity to connect, to collaborate, to expand and extend. That's step three. And then step four is to really listen well and to practice listening well. So when we're in those moments, we can respond appropriately. Now, the last two steps have to do with actually what you say, and that involves leveraging structure and focus. But it's those first four steps that you can really practice a lot in advance of the actual speaking. Let's take a situation, for example. I'll give you two. Let's say you're going for a job interview or some kind of Q&A. You don't know exactly what questions are going to get asked, but you could certainly prepare in advance. You could come up with some specific themes that you want to get across in the interview. You could have some specific examples that you want to support those themes. I'm not memorizing answers here. Memorizing actually works against us. But I'm thinking through, if I were asked about my experience, I might share this and this. That type of preparation helps. In fact, you can go one step further. Use generative AI like Bard or ChatGPT and say, I'm interviewing at this company for this role. Create 3 or 4 questions for me. It'll spit out questions and you can immediately practice answering them. So that's some of the preparation you can do on top of what we've already done in terms of mindset. And then in small talk, same thing. I don't know what's going to happen if we're having chit chat, but I could say, I can think about some topics I might want to discuss, or I know certain things about the event that I might want to ask you about. So there's a lot you can do in terms of mindset and preparation before you ever become spontaneous. And by doing so, you'll be more comfortable and confident in those moments.
And you also mentioned one of the 6 steps is using structure. And in the book, you talk about using structure to be able to assemble thoughts on the fly. Can we explore this concept in a little bit more detail? Tell us more about these. You go through a few structures in your book. You don't have to go through the structure, up to you, Matt, you choose, but let's talk about the importance of structure in communication, including spontaneous communication.
Thank you. So anybody who's ever read anything I've done, seen any of my videos, or listened to Think Fast, Talk Smart, the podcast I host, knows that structure to me is so critical. I believe it is essential for effective communication. Our brains are wired for structure. In a moment, I'll define it. Many of us, especially when we're in the moment, put on the spot, we simply list out information, point after point after point. We itemize what it is we are saying. Our brains are not good at lists. In fact, I challenge you and all of your listeners to think about how many items do you need to buy at the grocery store before you actually have to write it down? For if you're like most people, it's like 4 or 5, and then I can't remember.
For me, Matt,
That's
it's
the
3.
3. There you go. Right. Yeah, me too. So the point is we need to have a structured way to help our brain intake information and remember it. To me, a structure is nothing more than a logical connection of ideas, a beginning, a middle, and an end. The most common structure most people are familiar with is problem, solution, benefit. If you've ever watched an advertisement on television, seen it online, they typically start with, here's an issue, a challenge, a problem. Here's how our product or service addresses that with our solution, and here's how you benefit. It's a logical way of packaging information up, and it turns out our brains respond very positively to structure. In fact, we call long-term memory episodic memory, episodes, little structures. So when we speak in the moment or plan, taking time to leverage a structure helps not only our audience to receive the information, but it helps us to prioritize and remember what it is we're saying. So having a structure is critical. And in the book, I give 10 or 12 different structures depending on different circumstances. Problem, solution, benefit is just one. There's past, present, future, comparison, contrast, conclusion. And perhaps later we can talk about my favorite, what, so what, now what. These are all helpful for people when they're communicating.
I was exactly about to ask you that because, yes, in the book, you say that the what, so what, now what structure is your favorite. So, again, for those who haven't read the book, tell us more about that structure and why it's so useful.
Absolutely. So I believe that this what, so what, now what structure is like the Swiss Army knife of communication structures. You can use it in so many circumstances. So let me define what it is. It's three simple questions: what, so what, and now what. What is the information that you're conveying? It could be your introduction of yourself. It could be a product or a service that you offer, could be an update that you're giving, maybe even feedback. So it applies in myriad situations. The so what is, why is the content you're sharing relevant to your audience? We have known for decades in academics that making the content relevant, specific, and salient makes the audience pay more attention to it, focus on it, and perhaps remember and act on it better. So the so what is critical. And then the now what is what comes next. It could be you ask if there are any questions, or you set up another meeting, or you get somebody to sign on the dotted line, or you do a demonstration. So what, so what, now what packages things up nicely. Let me give you three examples so people can see how it actually works. Imagine you're going to the dreaded update meeting where you're sitting around the table and everybody's sharing what the status of their project or report is. The what is your update? Here's what we've done: good, bad, not so good. The so what is why it is important for the project, for the timeline. And then the now what is what comes next. Maybe it's remediation. Maybe it's moving on to the next step. Maybe it's a request for help. When you write an email, I don't know about you, but I get lots of emails where I'm trying to figure out what does the person want here. So make the subject line the now what comes next, what you'd like. Then the body of the email is simply the what and the so what. And then the last example is, imagine you and I are in conversation and you ask me for feedback. The what is my feedback? I might say, that meeting went really well, but you spoke very quickly during the implementation plan and didn't give as many details as you did elsewhere. That's my what. When you speak quickly without details, people might think you're not as prepared as you were in other parts of the presentation. That's the so what. The now what is, next time you communicate, slow down and give more details about the implementation plan. So this structure, when practiced, can become a great way to package information up. And I encourage everybody to use it. Now, you see this smile on my face? I just want to point out, I just shared what, so what, now what by using what, so what, now what. I told you what it was, why it's important, and how you can use it. So it is an amazing tool for packaging information, answering questions. I love it and use it all of the time.
I love it too, man. And thank you for giving us so many examples. These are so useful for our listeners. And the email example, either I missed it from the book. I don't know if it, or maybe it's not included in the book. So using the now what as the subject line and then what
Yes.
and so what in the body. That's a great practical tip. I'm going to use it. Thank you.
Great.
And before you talked about your MBA student at Stanford, the exercises that you do with them, and again, we talked about the fact that in the book there are many examples of these exercises. There's one in particular which is a good one that comes from acting, comedy. By the way, you make a lot of references to comedy in your book as
Mm-hmm.
well. And you say that in conversations we need to train ourselves to go from no but or yes but to yes and. For those who are not familiar with these exercise or technique, can you tell us more?
Absolutely. So I am a huge fan of improvisation, and I have been blessed to be able to work with some amazing improvisers. I co-teach a class with a gentleman named Adam Tobin. He also teaches at Stanford. There's some other Stanford colleagues: Dan Klein, Patricia Ryan Madsen, Deborah Schifrin. These are amazing improvisers who've taught me many things about improv. One of the foundational principles of improv is this notion of yes and. Here's the amazing thing about improv. Many of us see, if you've ever watched improv, we think, oh my goodness, this is amazing. They're just making stuff up on the spot. And in some ways, they are, but they are actually following very specific rules that allow them to be free and creative in the moment. Yes, and is one of those rules. So when somebody gives you an offer, and that's what they call them, an offer or an opportunity, you don't reject it. You don't say no, you say yes. And that's what allows for amazing in the moment improvisation scenes. It turns out the same skills help you in everyday communication. So let's imagine you and I are in the midst of a conflict. I see something one way, you see it another way, and we're having a debate, a discussion, some kind of conflict. I can better connect us and get us to be collaborative in solving the problem if I look for areas where we agree. So if I say yes and to the things you're saying, now I'm not saying I agree with something I don't agree with, but it might be the case that you and I, while we see the solutions, possible solutions differently, we absolutely agree on the need to do something. And if I focus on that and lean into that, we might then find ways to collaborate. So if we're debating and I say, you know what? The bottom line here is we really want to solve this problem. Let's talk about the different facets of the problem to make sure we're aligned, and then let's look at the different solutions. By looking for that yes and, that area of commonality, it empowers us to seek out connection and to collaborate better. And this helps us not just with conflict, but in small talk, in other types of ideation and creative endeavors. So yes and is a very powerful way. Now, I am certainly not advocating that we always say yes to everything. That is not the way to live your life. But in these moments of spontaneity, when many of us get defensive and say no, it might be to our benefit to open up and say yes.
I think, Matt, that this principle is also useful in formal presentations, where even if it's not a spontaneous conversation, at least as a principle, even in a formal presentation, yes, you should be prepared. You know what you want to say. You've got your plan, your roadmap in terms of what you want to say, how you're going to say it. But then sometimes things get in the way. You may receive a response from an audience that you haven't anticipated, or maybe the technology gets in the way, the projector doesn't work. And so having this at least mental attitude of yes and allows you to go with the flow, accept whatever it is that happened, and then you go with the flow, you respond, and you continue.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. It sets us up for being present and for adjusting and adapting. Much of what gets in our way is the rigidity of our desire to accomplish things. And the fact is, life is ever changing, and we have to be able to navigate that change to be successful. The projector doesn't work, the microphone doesn't work. You say something that's not exactly what you wanted to say. We need to just take a yes and approach to help us get through it.
You say that if you think about, if I remember well, Matt, I think you wrote in your book that if you think about spontaneous speaking, the most important word for you is focus.
Mhm.
I-
Yes,
Okay, so it sounds like I remember well. Tell us more about that. What does that word mean in this particular context?
absolutely. So I call it the F word of communication, just to get people's attention to it. We often say more than we need to say, specifically in spontaneous in the moment communication. We often take our audience on the journey of our discovery of what we want to say as we're saying it. So we end up saying more than we need to. That can be very distracting and challenging for our audience. My mother has a saying. I know she didn't create it, but it is, tell me the time, don't build me the clock. Many of us, when we speak, especially in an impromptu fashion, say more than we need to. We simply need to tell the time And if people want to know more about how the clock was built, they can ask us with questions. So how do we get focused? As I mentioned earlier, we have to make sure our content is relevant, specific, and salient for our audience. Build from there. So when I'm answering a question, making small talk, giving feedback, I need to think about what's most relevant and salient for you and start my message from there. Second, I need to have a clear goal. In planned or spontaneous speaking, to me, a goal has three parts: information, emotion, and action. In other words, what do you want your audience to know? That's the information. How do you want them to feel as a result of what you're telling them? That's the emotion. And then the action. What do you want them to do? Most communication has an action part. If I think about in advance for a planned presentation, or the moment I walk into the cocktail party and I'm about to have small talk, what's my goal here? It helps you focus because it determines what you say and what you won't say. So lots of other ways to be focused. The biggest two are focus on relevance and have a clear goal, and your message will be tighter, clearer, and more concise so people can actually remember it and act upon it.
Your message will be tighter, more concise. Again, in the book, you give a fantastic example of Google, their mission statement. And so again, it'd be great if you could mention that example because it will be useful for our listeners. And also, as you explain the example in the book, you say that when communicating, we should try and include the least amount of information. And that's met again another counterintuitive idea. Most people they are expert. Like if you think about academics, but also in business, we know so much about our subject. We are also so close to it that we think that everything is important. And so we think that we need to communicate everything. Whereas you invite your audience, your readers to think about the least amount of information to communicate. Tell me more.
Absolutely. So parsimony, being clear, concise is critical in our communication. And you're exactly right. Many of us go in and say, here are all the things I want to say. And I think the best place to start is what is the least amount of information you need to say to get your point across, and then add more to it. Make it additive rather than subtractive. There's a wonderful activity in the book. I have lots of try this sections as you learn, as you go through the chapters. And one of my try it activities is go back and look at your texts. If you think about it, texting is really spontaneous speaking. A lot of us don't spend a lot of time. We just respond right away. Go back and look at a string of texts and think to yourself, how could I have said this in a more clear, concise way? Think through the prioritization process that you need to go through. In other words, you're asking yourself, what's the least amount of information I could have provided to get the point across?
Hi there. Before we continue with this episode, I just wanted to take a moment to share with you some resources that I believe would be super useful for you. The first one is my book, Confident Presenter. Check it out. You can find it on Amazon. I'm going to include the link in the show notes. It's a book for business owners, leaders, and the teams who want to become more credible, confident, and convincing presenters. To make the most of the book, take the Confident Presenter Scorecard, which is an online tool that allows you to assess your current presentation skills in less than 3 minutes for free. You just need to answer a few questions. The scorecard will give you a score from 0 to 100%. It will tell you what that score means for you, and it will also identify opportunities for improvement. And then the last thing is my web class. I often run free presentation skills web classes where I go through my own process for creating my own presentations and those of our clients. So if you're interested, I'd love to see you there. I'm going to include all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to a podcast. It means the world to me. Now, let's jump back into the conversation.
And by drilling that, you become more comfortable in speaking in a much more crisp, clear way. When we build from the core, it is easier to be focused than when we start with everything and try to make it tighter. And doing something as simple as looking at our texts can help us learn how to do that better.
And again, Matt, would you mind sharing the Google example? Again, it can
Oh,
be.
yes, absolutely. So, yes. So, Google spent a tremendous amount of time. I happen to be friends with and teach with Raymond Nasser, who is one of he was head of comms or worked in their comms group as they were trying to define their specific mission statement. And it was all over the place. And so what they really did is they started taking away information. They said, what is the essential core of what it is we're trying to get across? And from there, they built the mission statement, which has been around and is still in existence today. And all of us can leverage that same approach. What are the critical few things we want to get across, and then build from there? It really makes a difference.
And if we compare their mission statement with the mission statement of so many other companies, which maybe they include 100 words or like a
Yes.
1,000 words, who knows? We can see the difference. Now, in addition to being concise, focus also means simplifying our communication. Again, in the book, you talk about the curse of knowledge as a big problem in communication. That's why we need to avoid acronyms or industry specific terminology. And you give another great example, which is Lego and what they need to do to be able to write instructions for kids. Can you give us the example as well? And again, explain what's the connection with simplifying your communication?
Yes. So I am actually a huge fan of this notion of accessibility. I don't like this notion of dumbing things down. I don't think that's the way. But many of us talk about very complex information, technology, science, finance. These are things that are very complex, and we have to make them accessible to people who have less knowledge than us. And most of us, when we communicate about these complex topics, as you mentioned, suffer from the curse of knowledge and the curse of passion. We know too much about it because we've worked too much on it, and we care a lot about it. And our audiences don't always know as much or care as much as we do. So we have to make sure that we think about information from their perspective. I like to say the only antidote to the curse of knowledge and the curse of passion is empathy. And as you mentioned, Lego is a fantastic example of this. I have been fascinated with Lego ever since I was a little kid, when my kids played with it. To this day, actually, to help me focus and calm down, I'll build Lego. I joke that it's actually cheaper than therapy. And as you can see on the shelves behind me, there are several examples of Lego creations. This is a Lego creation, as is this. It's a way of focus. And I've always been in awe of the company. And for the book, I interviewed many, many people from different lines of work. And I interviewed the gentleman who is in charge of creating Lego manuals. And if any of you have ever seen a Lego manual, the one thing you know is there are no words. They create manuals that anybody who speaks any language can build their products. And the manuals are very clear and focused. The key to their success is they know down to the intimate details about their audience. So before you ever craft a Lego manual, you spend up to a year learning about what people of different ages can do relative to the product. So they can tell you the difference between what a 5-year-old can do with Lego bricks all the way up to an adult. And that helps inform how they craft their manuals. We all need to better learn and understand our audience, their needs, their abilities, their knowledge, and then craft content that is specifically targeted to those needs. That's what I mean by empathy. That's what I mean by being audience focused and audience centric. The number one bit of advice that all of the communication experts I've ever interviewed on my podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smarter, for the book, have all said the single most important thing to be a better communicator is to know your audience. And the Lego example, I think, is absolutely brilliant to emphasize the importance of that.
The Lego example resonated with me for two reasons. One is
Yes.
the, of course, the communication element, what it says from a communication perspective. And also, my wife works with children,
Uh-huh.
and she specializes in child's development. So we often talk about children development, what they should be able to do at different stages of their development. And so we always talk about these things. So it was a very good combination of communication, which is my passion, and what we talk about at home. So that's why it resonated with me. And actually, Matt, talking about my wife, now in the book, as you said earlier, in the second part of the book, you give lots of practical frameworks that people can apply in specific situations. Now, we don't have time today to go through all the different scenarios that you cover in the book, but there's one in particular, which is how to say sorry. And you give a framework for you to be able to do that in a more effective way. And I've used that framework
Oh.
last weekend with my wife, and it worked. So thank you very much, because so far it was always a bit of a struggle. And again, for those who haven't read the book, can you tell us more about that framework for saying sorry more effectively?
Well, I am always happy to help people manage their relationships better. So I'm certainly happy that the structure worked for you. I am sorry that you found yourself in a situation to use it, and I'm not going to ask you what the circumstance was, although I am curious. Um, so apologizing is absolutely a difficult challenge for many people, and it often crops up in the moment. So we say something that's inappropriate, we do something that is offensive to people, etc. We must take time to apologize, and we have to apologize in a very legitimate way. Often we will apologize not for what we've done, but for how we've made someone feel, which is not an apology, right? I'm so sorry that I made you feel upset versus I'm sorry for what I did that made you upset. So we need to really apologize better, honestly, sincerely, and with contrition. So, as with everything, I try to give a structure in a way to remember the structure easily so you can deploy it. So I have a mnemonic. I call it triple A. Here in the United States, triple A is our roadside service. If your car breaks down, you call triple A. It's the American Automobile Association, and they come help you fix it. So I think triple A also helps you fix these challenging moments where we need to apologize. And the A's stand for this: first, acknowledge, then appreciate, and finally make amends. So the acknowledgement step is to identify the offending behavior and then take responsibility for it. So if I'm with colleagues in a meeting, I might say, I am sorry that I interrupted you in the midst of your sharing a point of view in the meeting. That's my acknowledgement. Appreciate, the second step, is to publicly accept how that offense has impacted other people. So I might say, by interrupting you, I demonstrated that I devalued what you were saying, and I prevented others from hearing the insights you might have shared. That's my appreciating the consequences of my action. And then finally, amends, or when I detail how I'm going to make up for the offense or what I'm going to do differently in the future. I might say, in the future, I will be sure not to interrupt. And in fact, I will try to paraphrase what everybody says before contributing my point of view. So a formal, complete apology from my mind does all three of these. It acknowledges, it appreciates, it makes amends, it invokes the AAA. So in the moment when you have made the offense, you can actually remind yourself of what you may want to say. So it helps you get to that when you need to help you. So I'm glad you were able to leverage it. I'm curious, in what ways did it help you to use that structure? Again, I don't want to know the specifics.
No, yeah, for me, it was the last A that was always missing in
Yes.
my previous apologies. So making amends and being very clear about I will try to do in the future, at least to make amends, is was the missing point in my apologies.
Excellent. So if that's what a good structure does, is it reminds you to include things, and in some cases reminds you to include things in a specific order. So it sounds like this was helpful to you because it reminded you to include something that sometimes you leave out, and
Yep.
that's awesome.
Yeah,
That's great.
definitely. So thanks again. And Matt, as we approach the conclusion of our conversation, I do have a couple of other things to ask,
Sure,
but
absolutely. Happy to.
if you if you think about what we talked about today, like communication in general, Beyond your own resources, your book, which I recommend, we're going to include it in the show notes. You've also interviewed, as you said, top experts in communication for your podcast. Is there one book, or it doesn't have to be one, it could be a few books that come to mind that made an impact for you that you would recommend?
There are a number of books that I find incredibly valuable. I'll share two with you. The first book that I always recommend to people about effective communication skills is a book that came out many, many years ago. It's called Made to Stick. It's by Dan and Chip Heath. And it's all about how do you craft messages that will actually stick in people's minds. Very, very important book. I refer it all the time. It's on the bookshelf behind me. It's dog-eared and underlined, very useful. And then another book by Patricia Ryan Madsen called Improv Wisdom. You don't have to be an improviser. You don't have to even enjoy improv. But what she does is she articulates very specific guidelines that apply to improvisation and how we can leverage them in our daily life. And this book was transformational for me, changed the way I approach my communication, I approach my relationships, I approach the way I organize my day. So Made to Stick and Improv Wisdom are two books that are on my bookshelf. I've read them multiple times, which is very rare for me, and I think many people would benefit from.
Made to Stick, I know it very well. I don't know the second one, but
Improv Wisdom, yes.
yeah, I took note, so thank you. And talking about your book, now that the book is out, this is just out of curiosity. If you could go back to it and change something, add something, remove something, change something, would you do it? And if so, what would you change? I'm just curious because I read the book. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so thank you. And I appreciate you reading the book as thoroughly as you clearly did. So I'm pleased with the way in which I discuss the methodology. I think that it covers it in a clear way. I would actually love to include many more examples. One of the things that I did at the back of the book in the very final appendix is there's a QR code, and that QR code points to videos that I have created on these different topics, and I will continue to update. There are also other infographics and other articles to help people, but I would do more of that throughout the book. I think the best way to learn communication is to do communication. So I hope people go to that QR code, check out those videos. If and when I update the book, I'm going to put even more in the midst of the methodology to help people. It's one thing to read about it. It's another thing to see it. It's another thing to do it. Those are the things that that's the big thing I would change.
Yeah, I think any skill that requires knowledge and technique, like what we're talking about here, it's the same. You started by mentioning an example of a coach. So learning how to play a new sport, we need knowledge
Yeah.
and technique. And when we've got this combination, I agree, what really makes a difference is practice. And Matt, if anybody wants to connect with you, where should they go? Where do they find you?
Thank you. The single best place to go to find anything about me and to connect with me is to mattabrahams.com. I also am a big user of LinkedIn, so follow and link in there. And please listen into the podcast, Think Fast, Talk Smart. We have lots of ways to interact with us through that as well. So I appreciate the opportunity to share that, and I would look forward to connect with any of your listeners in any of those ways.
And I'm going to include your links in the show notes. And that's,
Thank
by the
you.
way, now that you mentioned this, it's true that we connected on LinkedIn. So that's how our conversation
Yes.
started. Yeah. And Matt, is there a question that you would have liked for me to ask and I haven't done it? Have I missed something? If you think about spontaneous speaking, anything else that you would like to mention?
I think you did a fantastic job asking lots of a variety of questions that clearly demonstrated that you've thought about this topic and seen how it can apply to your life. And I appreciate that. The one area that we did not discuss that I think is crucial for all communication, especially spontaneous speaking, is listening. I mentioned it briefly, but in order to be a better speaker, you absolutely have to be a better listener. In the case of spontaneous speaking, it has to do with the fact that we need to make sure we respond appropriately. Many of us listen just enough to get the general idea of what somebody wants, and then we click into judging, evaluating, and acting without actually really listening for the nuance and detail of what's needed in the moment. Let me give a quick example. Let's say you and I come out of a meeting and you say, Matt, how do you think that went? I immediately hear feedback and I begin itemizing all the things you did wrong, could have done better, we should have done differently. But had I listened really carefully, I might have noticed you came out of the room through the back door. You were looking down. Your voice was quiet. What you really wanted in that moment when you asked, how do I think it went, was not feedback, but was support. And by me itemizing all the things that went wrong, I did a disservice and maybe damaged our relationship. So we need to listen for the bottom line, the key issue, not just to what's said, but how it's said, where it's said. And that listening increases the likelihood that we'll respond appropriately. So if there was any topic that we didn't give justice to, and I'm not faulting you by any means, but it would be that listening that I think is really critical.
Yeah, and that's why I asked. So thank you for pointing it out. And maybe it could be listening, it could be something else. If you think about all the things we discussed, spontaneous speaking in general, communication, let's say that somebody watches this interview, they listen to it, and let's say, Matt, that in a few days, that once they've listened to the conversation, let's say that they forget everything. Not because it's your fault, it's just because how.
No, it's fine. Hey, I get it. I get it.
And let's say that they forget everything, but that they remember one thing. Let's say that they remember one thing. And if they remember that thing, then you would be happy. What's the one thing you would like listeners to remember from this conversation?
We all can put in work to become more confident, clear, and compelling communicators. It takes three things: repetition, reflection, and feedback to do that. You have to practice, you have to reflect to see what needs to be changed and what you should lean into, and then you have to get feedback from trusted others. So if people take nothing else away from our conversation, and I certainly hope they take away a lot, it's that you can get better at your communication and it's well worth it to do so.
Matt, thank you so much. I have to say, over the last few years, I've had the privilege of interviewing quite a few people, all experts in areas connected to the theme of this podcast, which is around leadership communication, public speaking, presentation skills, including people like Seth Godin, Daniel Ping, Dr. John Medina, Carmine Gallo. You've interviewed Carmine. I think you've interviewed Carmine.
Yes, I've interviewed almost all of those folks.
Yeah. So you know them. Now, apart from, I'm not talking about these people, but in general, you've been an amazing guest. So thank you. The way I can see that you are a pro in communication. The way you've answered the questions and the flow of the conversation has been amazing, in addition to the actual content and the insights that you've shared. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that compliment. The folks you mentioned, I aspire to their depth of knowledge and ability to communicate. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you've conducted the interview and the depth that we got. So thank you. It was quite a pleasure to chat with you.
Perfect. Thanks again, Matt. All the very best. Let's keep in touch. And considering the time of year, now we are recording this, which is the 18th of December today. So have a wonderful festive season, and I wish you all the best, and enjoy your time with your loved ones.
Thank you. I wish the same for you and your family.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Ideas on Stage podcast, there are many more you might like, so please subscribe, leave us a review, and tell us what you think. You can find many more ideas on business communication at ideasonstage.com or by searching for Ideas on Stage on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and goodbye for now.